Welcome back everyone, it's Aric from Rare Candy, and today I'm going to break down my current list for the new Whimsicott VSTAR deck. So Whimsicott is a powerful new Pokemon we're getting in the new Brilliant Star set that can lock your opponent's special energy. And as you can see, we are going to be pairing it with the Rider Calyrex VMAX as well. I'm honestly not sure if this is still the best way to run Whimsicott, or Shadow Rider for that matter either, but this definitely seemed like a natural starting point to begin testing from. And also guys, if you want to stay up to date with the rest of my Brilliant Stars decks and as I'm working on them, you guys can check out the Rare Candy Patreon. I've been dropping bonus lists over there every week, so check that out. Link will be in the description if you guys want to support this channel and get some bonus content. But with that being said, be sure to smack that like button to get this video out to more people, and let's jump into the deck list and see how this Whimsicott deck is going to look. So up first, we do have 4 copies of Rider Calyrex V. As I mentioned, we are pairing this with the VMAX to be able to accelerate our Psychic Energy into play. But as you can see, I'm not playing any of the promo Rider Calyrex V, and that's because this first attack on the main one here from Chilling Reign for a Psychic Energy does 10, but it locks your opponent's special energy and stadium cards. So one thing I do like about this deck is that even though you can't start attacking with Whimsicott until turn 2, if you go second on your first turn, you can actually still start locking your opponent's special energy right out the gate. But more importantly, we have 4 copies of Rider Calyrex VMAX here. This is going to be the main way we are going to be accelerating our energy. So of course it has that Underworld Door ability. We can attach a Psychic Energy from hand to one of our bench Psychic Pokemon and draw 2 cards. So of course we can power up our Pokemon and see a couple of extra cards per turn. And also, we do still need Shadow Rider, I think, for the late game. A lot of games I've found so far with this deck, I will lead the game with Whimsicott to kind of slow down our opponent, and then we'll come in with Max Geist towards the end of the game to take some big one-hit knockouts. Of course, Max Geist is 10 plus 30 for every Psychic Energy we have in play. Shadow Rider is also weak to Dark. That is something we need to keep in mind. This is going to be easily knocked out by things like Galarian Moltres V or Eternatus VMAX if we still see that running around. But one thing I do like about Whimsicott, it does at least provide a little bit of extra type coverage against those styles of decks. And speaking of which, up first we have 2 copies of Whimsicott V. We do need to evolve into our V-Star. Not a whole lot to really say about this thing. It does have 1 attack here for a Psychic Energy. It does 20. And if your opponent's active as a basic Pokemon, they can't attack on the next turn. You know, that's not always going to stick. They can usually play things like Switch or Retreat, but every now and again, this might be a slightly useful attack. We mainly just need it to evolve into our Whimsicott V-Star, which we are also playing 2 copies of in this deck. So Whimsicott V-Star, one of these new V-Star Pokemon, of course, has 250 HP, Meta Weakness, and a 1 retreat cost, and its main attack here for a Psychic and 2 Colorist is 160, and your opponent can't play any tools or special energy from their hand on their next turn. Very similar to the old Giratina EX, which was one of the most powerful cards in the format that it existed in, and this attack is pretty good against a number of different decks even in today's game. Think of decks like Rapid Strike Urshifu, Single Strike decks, even Mew VMAX. There's a ton of special energy running around, and even though some of these decks do have some ways at trying to play around this attack, it's still very annoying and can still maybe slow them down enough for you to amass enough energy into play to pivot into Shadow Rider in the late game. And Whimsicott's V-Star power is an attack for a Psychic Energy. It does 60 for each Psychic Energy attached to Whimsicott to one of your opponent's Pokemon. So even though usually we do want to be leaning a little bit more heavily on this first attack to slow down our opponent, this V-Star attack is still really solid. You have the potential to even snipe undamaged Pokemon VMAX on your opponent's bench. So this thing can definitely be a very strong late game attack once you have a few Shadow Riders in play. Next up though, we do have 1 copy of Galarian Articuno in the deck. So we're playing Articuno for this ability. Whenever we bench it from hand, we can attach up to 2 Psychic Energies from hand to this Pokemon. So as I mentioned, we typically do want to lead the game with Whimsicott, but in the late game, I found we do want to transition into our Rider Calyrex just because it has more HP and it has huge one-shot potential with Max Geist. So Articuno is going to be another way we can get an extra 60 damage on the field a little bit more quickly. Articuno does have an attack as well. For 2 Psychic and a Colorist is 120 and you discard its energy. We're probably not using this most of the time, but I will say the math actually does work out nicely with Whimsicott. If we do 160, for example, to a Pokemon V-Star, theoretically later in the game, we can clean up that knockout with this attack, since in total that will do 280. Next up from there though, we have 1 copy of Crobat V to draw until we have 6 whenever we bench it, and we also have 1 copy of the new Lumineon V as well. So of course, Lumineon, much like Crobat, has a very strong ability whenever we bench it from hand, but this guy lets you grab any supporter from your deck. But going on to our supporter cards, we have 4 copies of Professor's Research, and we also have 2 copies of Marnie for our draw supporters. So a little bit on the lower side, guys, but again, with Rider Calyrex being able to draw us additional cards throughout the course of the game, we don't need quite as many draw supporters as most other decks would. But then from there, we have 3 copies of Boss's Orders to round out our supporter cards, just to choose what we want to attack into. For our stadium of choice, we do have 3 copies of Training Court. This has been a staple in Shadow Rider Calyrex decks. We get to get a basic energy from discard pile and put it into our hand. Obviously, we can grab energies back, then immediately throw them down with Shadow Rider to accelerate energy and draw some cards. Now, one thing I do want to say is that Training Court sometimes does feel a little bit awkward for this deck. And what I mean by that is it obviously pairs extremely well with Shadow Rider, but I do think it slightly conflicts with Whimsicott, because if you're locking your opponent's special energy, they might be forced to find their basic energies to get off an attack. And having Training Court in play can sometimes be a liability, giving your opponent maybe a couple more outs to basic energy. So I'm not sure if maybe this needs to be like Old Cemetery or something else, but I will say Training Court is definitely a double-edged sword with Whimsicott as Shadow Rider's partner. And that's one of the reasons why I'm still not sure if this is the best way to run either Shadow Rider or Whimsicott. Just something to keep in mind. Up next from there, we have 4 copies of Fog Crystal. We can search our deck for a basic Psychic Pokemon or basic Psychic Energy and put it into our hand. Obviously, fantastic card to help get our deck set up in the early game, and also in the mid game, it can grab a Psychic Energy to accelerate with our VMAXs. That being said, we are still playing 4 copies of Quick Ball in the deck as well. We do want to see a ton of cards in the early game. We want to get at least 2 Shadow Riders and a Whimsicott in play if possible, bare minimum on turn 1. So we need a lot of these Pokemon search cards to ensure that. Up next from there, we have 3 copies of Ultra Ball as well. Of course, one of the absolute best cards we are seeing reprinted in Brilliant Stars. We can discard 2 cards from our hand and search our deck for any Pokemon. And to round out our Pokemon search options, we have 3 copies of Evolution Incense as well, just to find our Evolution Pokemon. We do have some tool cards in the deck. The first one is going to be Choice Belt, another new card we're getting in Brilliant Stars, and going to help us do 30 more damage to our opponent's Pokemon V. So of course, this is going to help our Shadow Rider Calyrex hit for those big numbers we need to take big one-shots. But also it does fix a little bit of math for our Whimsicott as well. Certain Pokemon do have over 320 HP, and we will need something like Choice Belt to comfortably 2-shot those sorts of Pokemon VMAX. Also, since this does bump up Whimsicott's damage to 190, that is enough to knock out some basic Pokemon V in the format, like Crobat, Lumineon, and others. We also have 2 copies of Air Balloon just to give our Pokemon 2 less retreat. Very important for this deck because Shadow Rider is always accelerating energy onto the bench. But with that being said, we also have 1 copy of Switch in the deck and 1 copy of Escape Rope as well. Just because, again, like I said, we are accelerating energy onto the bench. I've been going back and forth for a lot of my decks, the right count of Switch versus Escape Rope. Right now I'm opting for just the even split between the 2. But depending if Galarian Weezing is still popular, going into the Brilliant Stars format, the Switch could become a 2nd copy of Escape Rope, but feel free to play around with these counts. And looking over to our energy cards, we're playing 13 copies in total of basic Psychic Energy. So of course we could opt to play something like a double Turbo Energy to more easily get Whimsicott up and running on turn 2, but I do think in the late game that might eat into your max damage of your Shadow Rider, so we are just keeping it simple here with the 13 copies of basic energy instead. So this deck list probably does look a little bit familiar. This is very much so a Shadow Rider deck featuring Whimsicott. Basically the idea is instead of playing something like Alchemy to have a big one-shot option, Whimsicott instead slows down your opponent to allow Shadow Rider to amass enough energy to take big one-shots on its own. Definitely let me know your full thoughts down below in the comment section. What do you think of this deck list? Are there any cards you think I should have included in here? Do you think Whimsicott should be played in a different deck entirely? Let me know your full thoughts down below. But that being said, if you did enjoy this deck profile today, be sure to smack that like button. And if you want to take your support to the next level, you can also become a patron and get some early Brilliant Stars deck lists or pick up some merch over at rarecandytcg.com. Links to those will be down below in the description. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.